Heartbreaking or filler? Hey y'all, how's it going? Welcome back. It's Mia, and today we are discussing episode 3 of The Last of Us. Thank you for waiting. I had to do some adulting yesterday. The video would have come out yesterday if I hadn't done any adulting. But anyway, let's talk about this episode of The Last of Us because we've got a departure from the main storyline talking about Bill and Frank. And I've actually seen some tweets that said, like this episode was a filler or took away from the Joel and Ellie storyline. And, I think I'm with the majority here when I say that this was just a really heartwarming, heartbreaking, emotional story. And there was an article in Vulture kind of talking about this phenomenon. It was basically trying to debunk, if anybody called this a bottle episode, it's not. There are better ways to describe a bottle episode than what we saw this past week. But so in Vulture, the author suggested using the term departure episode because it's kind of a break from what we've seen. It's just not one of those self-contained, it's self-contained in the way that it is not a part of the main storyline, but not as far as just taking place in one room and kind of one thing just happening and, maybe over the span of under a day. So that's that. But yeah, I was I like the term departure episode because that's what this was. And, considering that this not only was a departure from the main storyline, but also a departure from the canon, it made me wonder, was it worth it? If we're going to have a departure episode, it has to be worthwhile and it has to be a meaningful story. And I was I think this was definitely meaningful storytelling. So let's break this down. And, at the end of every episode, HBO releases a behind the scenes look where the creators talk about it. And so Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin, they were talking about this departure and they were okay, they did preface and they were this is probably the biggest departure that we've done from the canon so far. So, if you had any worries from here on out, are they going to change anything else or do anything big? This is probably, according to them, the biggest change that we're going to see in this series. So it's, it's not that bad. But yeah, I think what kind of took all of us by surprise, most of us watching or have, familiar with the games were wow, this is nothing like what happened in the game, but it was still absolutely fantastically done. Now, I made some predictions last week about this episode and trying to think okay, well, where can they go? And it's kind of funny because I will go back and kind of try to watch The Last of Us a little bit ahead of what is going to be presented this week. So I went ahead and watched kind of the arc for episode 3. And as I was taking notes from the game, I literally just said, Bill said he had a partner, so maybe we'll get some story about that or some backstory. Because I was this is the game they're playing here with The Last of Us. They're if anything is remotely kind of dropped about this was that or this is what I did then, they're going to expand on it. Little did I know they were going to expand on it a lot more than I thought was going to happen. Now, just so we're kind of eye to eye here talking about managing my expectations, this is what I knew coming in. I'll kind of walk you through what happened in the game if you're not familiar. So basically, we move on from the state house. Everything kind of happens similarly the way we saw it in the series. And Joel knows that he needs to get a car in order to go out, meet his brother out west. And so he's I think Bill would be able to hook me up with that. So basically, Joel and Ellie walk their way to Bill's. Bill is this kind of the same that we see him in the series, a little bit of a cynic. He's kind of a conspiracy theorist kind of guy. He's very paranoid, keeps people out, keeps himself in. And so basically the entirety of that arc is just them. They want a car. Bill has a car, but they need a battery. So they go out to this other location where he should have the battery. When they finally get to the place where the battery should be, the battery ain't there. So they kind of have to escape because the infected are on their tail. They're kind of out of luck until they take cover and refuge in this house. Of course, it's abandoned because no one else is there, except they see that a guy has hanged himself, hanged, and it just happens to be Frank. And Joel in the game is none the wiser. He was oh, Frank, and Bill is yeah, that was my partner. So it was really a small little throwaway line, and that's why I was just kind of okay, throwaway line here. We've got some backstory that we can establish. And by the end of the game, Joel and Ellie put the battery in the car. and they're on their merry way. So what I was expecting was that maybe we definitely were going to get backstory about Bill and Frank, but I thought it was going to kind of plant itself back into the game canon where we pick up present day with Joel and Ellie. They go meet Bill. Frank is missing. He's been gone for a couple of days. And then when we see that Frank ended up unaliving himself, Roblox language, we find it would just make that death a little more bittersweet just because of the fact that, you know, we got to spend some time with him before. So yeah, having said that, this was a lot more emotional than I ever thought this episode was going to be. And, you know, the reviewer said it was going to be emotional. I was just like, well, I mean, how much can you do? And I think it's the fact that they just decided to spend so much time with these characters. I mean, more than 60 minutes. I was like, literally, guys, if this had been just a couple of minutes longer, they could have released this as a feature film, put out in cinemas, and it would have been a whole movie. Like, if they could stretch that to 90 minutes, I'm sure they could. But yeah, there were just some wonderful little moments, and I think that's what really makes this story so wonderful. And I think it starts with this showing of a relationship between two gay men, two older men at that, where we really just don't see that on television in that way. So I thought that was kind of a wonderful look on that. And then just diving into the nuances of their lives, you know, like just those small moments, like when they got to eat strawberries for the very first time, or getting to see the kind of ups and downs of living with a person that you love in the middle of the apocalypse, right? Like, you know, Frank is like, hey, this is my home too now, and he just wants to go and paint the town, make everything look nicer and pleasant. And then getting to those final moments where Bill has to look after Frank, and then it makes you remember that throwaway line where Bill was like, you know, sorry, I'm getting older than you, or faster, or however he said that, and how kind of the roles had reversed with Frank's illness, which I believe they were alluding to AIDS. They never really said it out loud, but it kind of made it look like, you know, he was like, it was incurable before if he's got, you know, this autoimmune disease, and so now it's just kind of a bleak outlook for him. So yeah, that was just incredibly sad. And I did have a hunch in the beginning. It was just like a fleeting thought, really, not even a hunch, kind of like during their first day with each other. And, you know, Frank was explaining, he was like, well, I'm not a you-know-what, but, and I was like, I don't want to draw any conclusions here about Frank's life, past life. Maybe I should, he's not a real person, but just kind of the fleeting thought, I was like, this could open up a can of worms here. And who knows how they treat health in this way when you're in the middle of apocalypse. I'm sure that's not really a number one priority there, but that was just like a fleeting thought, and then it just so happened to be true, and I was like, oh no, why would I even think that? No. So anyway, the biggest twist for me after all of that was just the fact that, you know, Frank made his intentions clear. He was like, I just want this to be over, but I want to have a nice evening with you, my last day. But then the fact that Bill went ahead and spiked the entire bottle of wine anyway, where they get to have this kind of like semi Romeo and Juliet style ending, except for they both know that they're gonna die. I just thought that was kind of the icing on the tragic cake, and for Joel and Ellie to then finally pick back up with their story in the present day, and to find the letter, and for him to be like, you know, don't go into the room, that's just their little moment, no one needs to see it, made you curious. But it's kind of like, you know what, no, I respect their privacy, let them decompose in that bed until the end of time. It's so beautiful. It's like Pompeii or something with those two skeletons. So at the end of the day, I'm like, to me, yeah, this was a justified departure in the canon. And in that behind the scenes video I was talking about, Neil Druckmann kind of talked about their writing process, and he was like, if we have a new idea, essentially, he was like, this is how it goes when they're coming up spitballing for this series. If it's like the game or worse, then obviously they're like, let's just stick to the game's canon. But if they're in the writer's room for this series and they come up with something better, he's like, let's roll with that. And so I think that was a justifiable reason. And then on top of that, Craig Mazin was also explaining kind of like just their artistic view on this, and he was talking about how they wanted to take a look at this world and how things were changing over time through the lens of Bill, through the perspective of a man. And I'm like, I like that artistic agency that they took there. I think that because The Last of Us, it's kind of a zombie show, but it's more so really about this relationship between Joel and Ellie. It's about this world that they're living in. I think the whole Bill storyline and Frank contributes into that world building. So that's where that contributes there. And seriously, when we think about it, it's like this really doesn't change the whole story. It doesn't change the whole canon. It's just one tiny little branch at the end of the day where Joel and Ellie's storyline is still unchanged. We just changed this one little branch, this one little deviation, but it's not going to hurt. We don't have to prune the timeline or anything just because all of a sudden both Bill and Frank died. So before we wrap, I want to talk about that season 2 news because it was confirmed last week on Friday, I believe, that The Last of Us is for sure getting a season 2. And listen, if you don't want spoilers for The Last of Us going forward, you might want to tap out here and just kind of, of course, leave me a comment, leave a like, let me know what you thought about this video, this episode. But otherwise, let's talk a little bit about what could be going on with season 2, because I want to make a video about that, but this is the perfect time to talk about it. And so with this news, I'm a little cautiously optimistic about it because I just remember going into The Last of Us Part 2, I was very hyped for it, knowing that the story in Part 1 was so good. I was like, I cannot wait for Part 2. Here's the thing though, when I began watching, some of the Let's Plays about it, I just wasn't really vibing with the story. And I know this game has been kind of covered in controversy really since day one, and I guess a lot of it has been about, I can't really pinpoint it, but obviously the fact that Joel dies, Abby kills him, golf club things happen, and so yeah, I get why people would be upset about that. Don't get upset about arguments about female protagonists and all that stuff. That's garbage anyway. But for me personally, I just remember not liking the direction of the storyline, maybe just because there was this absence of Joel and Ellie as a dynamic duo, and I just couldn't move away from that. So I'm like, despite all of the controversy and criticism, it's still like relatively highly rated, like on Metacritic, and I think it stands that it's worth giving a shot if that's what they want to adapt for season 2. It's just, I'm like, okay, well, I need to go back, rewatch the story, take a look at it again, from a fresh pair of eyes and see how it suits me. But I think more so the interesting thing about it will be like if they are like going to faithfully adapt like they're doing now, if they're going to faithfully adapt The Last of Us Part 2 in season 2, I wonder how that's going to carry with kind of the casual television watching audience, where to me, it seems like Pedro Pascal, his role as Joel, really carries the series. I mean, he's a huge staple of the series. He's Pedro Pascal, So I'm like, if he dies early on, I wonder how that is going to sit with the general TV watching audience, the casual fans who aren't really seeped in the knowledge of the game. They might come to find some spoilers eventually. I think it will probably be inevitable, but it's like, okay, but will this series be good enough for them to the point where even without their lead star from season 1, it'll still be good for season 2. So we'll see. We're far ways away from that. I mean, we're only in episode 3 of season 1, so we got plenty of time to sit on that and think about how it's gonna go, but just made me think. So yeah, I am gonna officially leave it there, guys. Let me know what you thought about this episode or about the season 2 news down in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Please also leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more. We'll be back next week with episodes 4 review, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.